-30 Celsius. No tent, no fire burning through the night. Just open ground, open sky, and a Comanche warrior asleep under a folded hide, breathing slow, waking at first light unharmed. A modern winter camper facing the same night would need a mummy bag rated below -30, an insulated sleeping pad engineered to stop ground conduction, a bivy sack to cut wind, and a base layer system built from synthetic fibers developed in a lab. Even fully equipped, with all of that gear functioning exactly as designed, professional guides still treat a night like this as genuinely dangerous. The kind of cold where a single design flaw in your system, one exposed gap, one piece of gear that fails, ends the trip and possibly the person. The Comanche did this without any of it, not occasionally, not as an emergency measure, but as a routine, repeated feature of a way of life built entirely around movement. Raiding parties, hunting expeditions, war parties riding for days across open plains, all of it requiring warriors to sleep exposed, night after night, through winters on the southern plains that could turn lethal in a matter of hours for anyone unprepared. This wasn't toughness. It wasn't just a high tolerance for suffering. It was a system, a specific, learned, transmitted body of knowledge covering material preparation, ground physics, wind reading, and body positioning, refined by people for whom a mistake meant a warrior who didn't return. Take that system apart, and what you find isn't folklore. You find a working thermal engineering solution, built entirely from animal hide, dry grass, and an intimate understanding of how a human body loses heat. To understand what the Comanche were solving for, you have to understand the specific version of winter they were solving it against. The southern plains, the territory across what is now Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and eastern New Mexico, don't fit the popular image of a Great Plains winter as steady, predictable cold. What defines this region instead is volatility. A relatively mild day can be followed, within hours, by a blue norther, a fast-moving cold front that drops temperatures 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit in a single afternoon, dragging brutal wind behind it across open, largely treeless grassland, with nothing to slow the air down. A warrior riding out under a clear sky at 10 degrees above freezing could be sleeping in -20 within a day, with almost no warning and no time to build permanent shelter. This volatility is the reason a fixed structure like a teepee, however well engineered, wasn't always the answer. The Comanche were among the most mobile horse cultures in North American history, built around long-range raiding, hunting bison at speed, and covering enormous distances that a heavy hide lodge simply couldn't keep pace with. A raiding or war party moving fast needed a sleep system that traveled on horseback with essentially no setup time, something you could unroll in minutes on whatever ground you happened to stop on, in whatever weather had caught up to you, and pack away again before first light. That single requirement, extreme cold performance with zero setup infrastructure, is the exact problem this entire survival system exists to solve. It's worth being precise about what surviving outdoors actually requires, because the threats aren't equal. Cold air alone, if you're still and dry, is a slower killer than most people assume. What actually kills in these conditions is heat loss through 3 specific mechanisms working together. Convection, as moving air strips warmth directly off exposed skin and thin clothing. Conduction, as a body loses heat directly into cold ground it's in contact with, which happens far faster than most people expect, because ground conducts heat away from a warm body more efficiently than still air does. And radiation, as the body's own thermal energy simply radiates outward into open sky with nothing to reflect it back. A functional outdoor sleep system in extreme cold has to interrupt all 3 of these losses simultaneously. stop the wind, stop the ground, and stop the open sky from pulling heat away. Or it fails, regardless of how much insulation you're wearing. This is precisely how the Comanche system was built. Whether or not anyone who used it would have described it in exactly those terms. Every component addresses one of those three losses directly. And this knowledge didn't exist in written form. It moved the way all technical knowledge moved in a culture without a writing system built for it. Passed down directly, generation to generation, through demonstration and correction. Refined continuously by the same unforgiving feedback loop that shaped every other survival system covered on this channel. A young warrior learning to prepare a robe, choose a campsite, or position a fire wasn't being taught tradition for its own sake. He was being taught a specific, tested method, because the version of the method that didn't work had already been tried, had already failed someone, and had already been discarded generations earlier. What remained by the time it reached him wasn't guesswork. It was the surviving output of centuries of exactly the kind of real-world testing no modern gear lab could ethically replicate. Testing where the penalty for a design flaw wasn't a bad review, but a warrior who didn't wake up. It starts with the material that did more of that work than anything else: the buffalo robe. A buffalo robe is not simply a hide. It's a processed material. And the processing is where most of the engineering actually happens. Bison carry an extraordinarily dense winter coat, thick underfur beneath long guard hairs, grown specifically to survive plains winters that regularly hit the same brutal temperatures a sleeping warrior needed to survive. Hides taken in late fall or winter, when that coat was at its heaviest, were the ones selected for robes rather than the thinner-haired hides taken in summer. And that seasonal selection alone tells you the choice of material was deliberate, not incidental. Turning a raw hide into a usable robe was skilled, labor-intensive work, typically done by the women of a band, involving fleshing the hide to remove fat and tissue, then working it, often with a mixture of the animal's own brain matter, which contains natural fats and enzymes suited to the task, to break down the fibers and keep the hide soft and pliable rather than stiffening into rawhide as it dried. A properly brain-tanned robe with the hair left on stayed flexible even in extreme cold, which mattered enormously because a hide that stiffens in freezing temperatures becomes useless as a wrap. It can't conform to the body, can't seal gaps, can't be pulled tight against wind. Flexibility at -30 degrees isn't a comfort feature. It's the difference between a functioning insulation layer and a frozen board. The hair was left on, and its orientation mattered. Worn hair side in against the body, the dense fur trapped a layer of warm air directly against the skin. The same basic principle behind why animals grow winter coats in the first place. Fur doesn't generate heat. It holds still air close to the body, and still air is one of the most effective insulators available in nature. Worn hair side out, the same robe could shed snow and rain more effectively, keeping moisture from soaking into the hide itself, which mattered because a wet insulation layer loses most of its effectiveness and can accelerate heat loss rather than prevent it. Warriors adjusted this depending on conditions, a genuinely adaptive use of a single material to solve two different problems on two different nights. A single robe, well prepared, already outperforms what most people assume rawhide can do. But the real engineering shows up in how multiple robes were used together, because the Comanche system wasn't built around one thick layer. It was built around a layered system, one robe positioned beneath the body, one or more positioned above it. And that distinction, insulation below versus insulation above, turns out to be one of the most important decisions in the entire setup. Ask most people to picture staying warm outdoors in extreme cold, and they picture bundling up, heavy clothing, thick blankets pulled over the top. Almost nobody instinctively thinks about what's underneath them, and that instinct is exactly backward, because the ground is often the single largest source of heat loss a sleeping body experiences in cold conditions. The physics is straightforward once you see it. Air is a poor conductor of heat, which is why still air insulates well, but solid ground is a comparatively excellent conductor. A sleeping body in direct contact with cold earth loses heat into that ground continuously, hour after hour, at a rate that dwarfs the heat lost to the air above through convection and radiation combined. This is precisely why modern cold-weather sleep systems dedicate as much engineering to the sleeping pad beneath a person as to the bag surrounding them. Insulated pads today are rated with their own separate R value specifically because manufacturers learned, through exactly the same hard experience, that the layer underneath a sleeping body matters as much as the layer on top of it, sometimes more. The Comanche solution addressed ground conduction directly, and in layers. Before any hide was placed, dry grass, brush, or pine boughs, whatever insulating plant material the immediate terrain offered, was gathered and packed down to create a buffer between the body and bare earth. Dry, dead plant material works on the identical principle as felt or fiberglass. Its fibrous, irregular structure traps countless small pockets of still air. And that trapped air is what actually does the insulating, not the material itself. A thick bed of packed dry grass could add a meaningful insulating buffer against ground conduction before a single hide was ever unrolled. On top of that plant layer went a robe positioned specifically as ground insulation, hair side up in many accounts, creating a dense, air-trapping cushion directly beneath the body, separate from and in addition to whatever robe or robes covered the sleeper from above. This is the detail that separates a genuinely engineered sleep system from simple bundling. The recognition that insulation has to work in both directions, that a person wrapped in heavy fur but lying directly on frozen ground will still lose the fight, because the ground doesn't care how warm your top layer is. Terrain selection reinforced the same principle. Where possible, warriors chose slightly elevated, well-drained ground over low depressions, because cold air, being denser than warm air, sinks and pools in low spots exactly the way water does, meaning a hollow or a stream bed could sit several degrees colder overnight than a slope only a short distance away. Dry ground was also strongly preferred over anything damp because moisture wicks heat away from a body dramatically faster than dry material does, through direct conduction into water rather than through comparatively inefficient dry air or dry fiber. Choosing where to lie down wasn't incidental to the system. It was one more decision inside it. Ground and body covered, the remaining variable was the air moving across the site itself. And that's a problem solved not by more insulation, but by positioning. Wind is the multiplier that turns survivable cold into lethal cold. Still air at -20 Celsius is dangerous, but manageable for a well-insulated body.
Excellent for four-season use.
Right,
The same
noted.
temperature with a sustained wind behind it strips heat through convection at a dramatically accelerated rate. The exact mechanism behind what's now formally measured as wind chill. Any outdoor sleep system that ignores wind, no matter how good its insulation, is incomplete. The Comanche approach to this was primarily about reading terrain rather than building structure, which made sense for a mobile war or raiding party without time to construct anything elaborate. A slight rise, a stand of brush, a shallow ravine, the base of a bluff, any natural feature capable of interrupting a prevailing wind was actively sought out as a campsite before anything else was decided. Positioning the body on the leeward side of even a modest windbreak, the side sheltered from the direction the wind was blowing from, could meaningfully reduce the convective heat loss a sleeper experienced through the night, even without any built structure at all. This is the same principle behind why modern backcountry campers are taught to camp behind natural windbreaks rather than in open, exposed terrain. The terrain itself becomes part of the shelter system, at zero material cost and zero setup time, which mattered enormously to a party that needed to move again at first light. Where a fire was used, and it wasn't always, since a visible fire could be a liability for a raiding party trying to avoid detection, its placement followed its own logic. A fire built low, kept small and controlled, positioned so that a natural or improvised windbreak sat behind it, would reflect a meaningful share of its radiant heat forward toward a sleeper, rather than losing it directly into open air on all sides. This is the same reflector wall principle still taught in modern wilderness survival courses. A heat source alone radiates in every direction and wastes most of its output into empty air. But a heat source paired with a reflective barrier behind it redirects a significant share of that same output toward the person who actually needs it. Coals were often banked, covered partially with ash or dirt to slow combustion, extending a fire's low, steady heat output across more of the night without requiring anyone to stay awake feeding it. The same small and constant beats large and intermittent principle that shows up again and again across Plains Indian fire management. Because a fire that burns hot and fast wastes fuel and attention that a small, sustained fire doesn't. Horses themselves sometimes factored into this equation too. Picketed or hobbled animals positioned near a sleeping site could function as a partial windbreak and, at close range, a modest source of radiant body heat. Not a primary strategy, but one more example of how the entire system treated every available resource, including the animals a war party already had to bring along regardless, as a potential contributor to staying warm. None of these individual measures, hide selection, ground insulation, terrain reading, fire placement, was sufficient alone. What made the system work was that all of them operated together, addressing convection, conduction, and radiation simultaneously on every single night a warrior slept exposed. This is worth emphasizing because it's the same principle that shows up across nearly every cold climate survival system this channel has covered, from felt jers to turf longhouses to earth lodges. No single material or trick ever did the whole job. Warmth in extreme cold was never the product of one good idea. It was the product of several adequate ideas, layered and combined, so that a weakness in one was covered by strength in another. And the final layer of the system wasn't material at all. It was the body itself, positioned and managed with the same deliberate precision as everything surrounding it. Even with ideal insulation above, below, and around a sleeping body, posture and body management still determined whether that insulation actually worked. A body curled into a compact, knees-drawn position exposes dramatically less surface area to cold air and cold ground than a body lying stretched flat. Surface area is where heat escapes. Shrink it, and you shrink total heat loss. The same principle behind why a curled animal in cold weather tucks its limbs and nose into its own body rather than sprawling out. This wasn't an unconscious sleeping position. In extreme cold, deliberately minimizing exposed surface area, keeping extremities tucked close against the warmer core of the torso, was a learned and reinforced habit because hands, feet, and the face, thin-skinned, blood vessel-dense extremities, lose heat disproportionately fast and are also where frostbite typically starts. Clothing underneath the robes followed the same layering logic as the robes themselves. Warriors typically wore leggings and moccasins of tanned hide, sometimes with fur linings or additional wrappings around the feet specifically. Because feet in direct or near-direct contact with cold ground were a persistent vulnerability that clothing alone had to manage even inside an otherwise well-insulated sleep system. Buffalo hide moccasins with the hair turned inward provided the same trapped air insulation at the extremities that the robes provided for the torso. The identical engineering principle, scaled down and applied to the parts of the body most likely to fail first. Where a party slept in numbers rather than alone, proximity itself became a tool. Bodies positioned close together, sometimes sharing robes across 2 or more people, took direct advantage of the fact that a resting human body radiates a genuinely substantial amount of heat continuously, simply through ordinary metabolism.
Keep it tight.
Heat that,
This
spread
Mylar
across
reflects
open
up to
air,
90%
is
of
largely
radiated
wasted,
body heat right
but
back to you.
that,
Stay
concentrated
shoulder to
between
shoulder.
2 or 3 bodies under a shared covering, meaningfully raises the effective temperature each person experiences. This is the same reason modern cold weather survival training still teaches huddling as a legitimate emergency technique. Shared body heat is a real, measurable thermal resource, not a folk remedy, and the Comanche system used it, deliberately whenever group circumstances allowed it. The cumulative result of all of this: prepared hide with adjustable orientation, a distinct ground insulation layer separate from the covering layer, deliberate terrain and windbreak selection, controlled and reflected fire heat where a fire was used at all, and a body actively managed for minimum surface exposure and maximum shared warmth, is a complete, functioning cold weather sleep system with no metal, no synthetic material, and no factory production of any kind behind it. It's also, when broken into its individual components, recognizably the same system modern cold weather gear is still built around. An insulated layer below the body treated as seriously as the layer above it. Wind protection treated as inseparable from insulation rather than an afterthought, and body positioning taught explicitly rather than left to instinct. Contemporary sleeping bag design, with its emphasis on minimizing dead airspace around a curled body and its increasing focus on ground-side R-value, is solving the exact same 3 problems: convection, conduction, radiation, that a Comanche warrior was solving with buffalo hide and packed dry grass on the open plains, in temperatures that would put most modern campers, fully equipped, in genuine danger. What's easy to miss, looking at this system from a modern vantage point surrounded by rated gear and lab-tested materials, is that none of its components were exotic or hard to obtain. Bison were abundant across the southern plains for most of the period this system was refined in, which meant hide was a renewable, continuously replenished resource rather than something rationed or scarce. Dry grass existed everywhere the terrain itself provided it. The only genuinely scarce resource in the entire system was knowledge. Knowing which grass held air best when packed. Knowing how thick a hide needed to be worked before it stopped stiffening in the cold. Knowing which slope would trap cold air overnight and which one wouldn't. That knowledge cost nothing to carry on horseback and weighed nothing in a saddlebag. And it was, in the end, the actual engine behind the entire system. The materials were common. The expertise in how to combine them, refined over generations of exposure to exactly this problem, was not. Strip away the assumption that sleeping outdoors at -30 without a tent was simply endurance, and what's left is a system. Hide chosen and processed for a specific purpose. Insulation deliberately placed both above and below the body. Terrain read for wind before anything else was decided. Fire heat reflected rather than wasted, and posture actively managed to protect the parts of the body that fail first. None of it was improvised in the moment. All of it was knowledge, passed down and refined by people for whom getting it wrong, even once, could be fatal. Modern cold weather gear, with all its engineered fabrics and rated insulation values, is still built around the same three physical problems the Comanche solved centuries earlier with buffalo hide and dry grass. The technology changed. The underlying physics and the discipline required to manage it correctly every single night never did. Never did. Never did.